Hi everybody and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to start off by thanking the Oxford Real Farming Conference for giving us this opportunity to do the session, and also to Dave, who's our volunteer today, helping us run the workshop. So for this session, we want to look at some of the issues with the current dominant supply chain model in the UK, which I'm sure is also replicated in other countries as well. And then we want to explore some of the opportunities for creating farmer-focused routes to market that reward agroecological farming. So I'm going to start off with a Mentimeter and then go through a few slides, and my colleague Vicky will also touch on some things. And then we're going to end with breakout room discussions. But before we go into that, I just wanted to quickly introduce ourselves and the alliance that Vicky and I work for. So I'm James Woodward and I work in the farming team for Sustain. And Sustain is an alliance of over 100 food and farming organisations. And for those who don't know us, we do all sorts of kind of policy and campaigning work around agroecological farming and supply chains, food poverty, food insecurity, children's health, and things like that. Vicky, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yep, so I'm Vicky Hurd. I'm head of farming at Sustain. I've been working in farm policy for 3 decades now, and really look forward to hearing really practical ideas that will come out from today. It's really great James has put this together because it will really help inform what we do and our alliance members going forward with finding better farmer-focused supply chains.
So what I'm hoping for today's session is that all of you joining us today will come away with some ideas that have sparked from the conversations, or that maybe you've met some new people today which are working in the space who share sort of similar interests to you. As Vicky said, for us, we're quite excited about what kind of information comes out of today, as it will help inform some of the work we're doing ourselves, which also might include meeting some new people as well. And it's a bit of a shame we can't be in Oxford and doing all the networking face-to-face stuff, but in these times it's good to be able to use things like Zoom. So as I said, to start with, we are going to try doing this Mentimeter. There are lots of people on the session. I think there's over 150 at the moment, so I don't know whether Mentimeter will kind of implode in on itself, but let's see what happens. I'm also conscious that some of you might it might not work on certain devices, or some of you might struggle to use it. I don't know why. So if that's the case, please don't worry about that. Right, I'm going to share the Mentimeter in the chat. So okay, so hopefully you can all see that, and hopefully that link should take you to a page. Should take you to a web page, and on there you should see some text boxes, and in each of those text boxes I would like you to write a word which you feel best describes the current dominant supply chain model that we have at the moment, and those answers should be given anonymously as well, so there'll be no kind of names attached to it. And then if you press submit and return to Zoom, I will share my screen, and there should be like a real-time page showing those coming through as a word cloud. So let's give it a go. As I said, it might not work massively well, but we shall see.
And we get to say 2 words, do we, James?
Yeah, you can either write in a single word or a very short phrase. There is a character limit. So hopefully you're seeing my Mentimeter screen. If anyone's having any problems, please do shout out in the chat. And I will just give a few seconds for you to submit those. But some very interesting ones are already coming through, as you can see. So unsustained, and the way that this word cloud works is that the most commonly used phrases and words are in the very middle and the bigger. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of common ways that people are describing it. So things like unsustainable, broken, exploitative, unfair, monopolistic, destructive, corporate, and all those things. Supermarket. Some very interesting ones there. So I'll just give a couple more seconds to see if anyone else is is coming through with anything. Things like centralised, I can see coming through on the chat. Yeah, definitely. Unpredictable, that's an interesting one. So yeah, so as you can see, that's some really interesting stuff. So thank you for participating in that, Menti, and it has actually worked, which is good. Right.
It shows that there's a problem we need to fix, doesn't it, James?
Absolutely, absolutely, exactly. Yes, and that's kind of part of today's talk, is to talk about some of those problems and the opportunities of how they could possibly be fixed on a farmer focused basis. Okay, I'm going to go back to my slides. So I'm just going to run through a few slides and touch on some of the issues. Vicky's going to touch on some of the grocery code adjudicator and statutory codes of practice work, and we'll touch on this phrase farmer focused. So when we're thinking about some of the issues and thinking about some of those things you've mentioned on Mentimeter, clearly this slide doesn't really consider everything. It's quite difficult to obviously put all the issues onto one slide, but I think these are certainly some of the main ones. It's also kind of worth noting that I think much of these issues require systemic change, and they can't really be solved by just tweaking individual problems here and there. So, you know, we're really talking about how supply chains can be changed more systemically rather than just little issues here or there. So firstly, sort of the first one, as you can see, kind of money and infrastructure and power within the supply chain is clearly heavily centralized. I believe it's only 10 supermarkets that control over 90% of the food that we buy in the UK. So with so kind of few markets for farmers to supply into, farmers are really forced into being price takers. And those supermarkets, I believe, include things like the big four, which are Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda and Morrison, who control about 70% of the market. And then Aldi, Lidl, Waitrose, Marks and Spencer's, Iceland, and the Co-op being the others that kind of take over 90%. And for me, this essentially means that it kind of maintains low farm incomes. And that's kind of seen in farmers receiving on average only about 8% of the food pound. So they receive a really small amount of the money that is sort of spent by the end consumer. And I think that's really reflected in the fact that around about 25% of UK farmers live in relative poverty in the UK. Around the world, there's obviously a much greater issue. And then it's also reflected in the fact that I think a lot of farmers, because of their low farm incomes, they really struggle to invest in their business for longer term economic, environmental sustainability reasons. Secondly, I think linked to that is that drives monocultures, and it drives kind of the requirement to use high amounts of kind of synthetic inputs like fertilizer and pesticides on a wider scale. And I think, you know, it's also this kind of centralized supply chain is also a real driver of habitat loss around the world. And we recently saw that in some pieces. I think that came out it was either December or early January, which showed the connection of British poultry feed to deforestation and land grabbing in Brazil. And I guess really this is essentially what happens when you really centralize money and power into fewer and fewer kind of multinational corporations. I've also put cheap food there as a policy driver because it has been kind of a priority government driver for many years to keep food cheap. And I think that it does cause issues, but in reality, it's part of a wider issue of underlying poverty and low household incomes more generally, and kind of alongside policy, poor policy making and economic thinking that might sort of drive those problems. But thirdly, really this is also linked to those top three, is that this has all kind of led to increasing consumption of ultra processed foods that require kind of fewer ingredients, which kind of need to be globally transportable. And this kind of consumption pattern, I think, has really been a major contributing factor to the increase in public health issues like obesity and diabetes and heart problems. And one thing Vicky and I were really keen to try and get into the agriculture bill, which has now become an act in the UK, was public health, being part of farming and food, obviously. And really that kind of monoculture agriculture and the consumption of ultra processed foods has kind of driven high food waste as well. It's a real driver of high food waste. Another issue is that food workers, those working in supermarkets and distribution centres, tend to get paid some of the lowest wages in the UK as well. And we're seeing this greater move towards automation of systems, which is obviously part of cutting costs for these big supermarket businesses, and process and stuff. But that obviously means a loss of jobs as well. So there's real issue with kind of low wage workers. And again, we saw recently Tesco's getting a bit of jip for underpaying their staff and not paying them the UK minimum wage, and they had to quickly kind of reimburse their staff. So there are those issues as well. And all of these things kind of make our increasingly sort of centralized, globalized food supply chain quite vulnerable to economic and environmental shocks. Something which I think we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic and the first lockdown in the UK. And we did see kind of empty fresh produce shelves in supermarkets at the beginning of our first lockdown, which was partly due to some panic buying, but I think it was also a sign that supermarkets do struggle to ensure a fair and smooth supply of food to people. I think also showed their inability to adapt and change under more difficult circumstances. So it kind of makes me think how they would cope with potential climate shocks in the future as we pass different tipping points. And we're also really yet to see the true impacts of Brexit on food supply as well. So kind of all in all, this centralisation is quite damaging to the environment, to farm and food businesses and to consumers. So I think there's a huge case to improve the standards of it and to redistribute some of that power and money towards a more diverse system. So Vicky, do you want to come in and talk about the GCA and the new statutory codes of practice?
Yes, thanks, James. Thanks very much for that quick swim through all those issues related to supply chain concentration. I was just going to very quickly say there have been some movement on this. I've been working on this for sort of about 20 years now. And one of the things that has been created, and it's slightly unique, well, was unique till relatively recently, was that the UK does have a adjudicator that monitors and enforces the grocery code for stopping abuse in supply chains. The groceries code was set up under the Grocery Code Act, which meant that we have a code that the top now 13 supermarkets are supposed to abide to when they're dealing with their direct suppliers. So that code doesn't apply when farmers are selling to somebody else who then sells to the retailer. It's only when they're selling directly to the retailer. But it's a very important piece of legislation, and it's a very important process because it shows that governments can step in when there is abuse. And one of the reasons that we got the Groceries Code and the adjudicator was because there was oodles of evidence of abuse. And I was part of the big lobby to get that Grocery Code adjudicator. And we now run the Groceries Code Action Network as Sustain to maintain pressure on that adjudicator, to keep strong pressure to make sure those 13 retailers play fair. And there's a book about that thick of all the abuse that was seen by retailers, and it's abuse of suppliers here and overseas. It's very important. It does cover overseas because about 40% of our food is imported. So we do evidence gathering, lobbying and research to keep pressure on that Groceries Code adjudicator to do its job, make sure abuse is reduced, and make sure that they're listening to farmers and growers and suppliers. And we want them to become stronger and use fines and do proactive research on abuse in the supply chain. So that's one thing. But what we've also lobbied for recently, because we know that the Groceries Code adjudicator is inadequate because they only cover the main retailers. It's really good that we have it. And it's really good that it's actually led to a European-wide directive on abuse in the supply chain. But as we're leaving Brexit, we needed something else to cover the rest of the supply chain. Those intermediaries between farmers and growers and the end use, be it a supermarket or the food service sector or wherever the food goes. So we lobbied for a statutory supply chain code of practice and an enforcement body and the means by which we can actually regulate the rest of the supply chain. And we got some form of that in the new Agriculture Act. It's got a fair dealing clause, which we pushed hard to get and we pushed hard to amend to try and stop that abuse. What that will lead to is a code of practice, statute codes of supply chain practice, largely focused probably on contracts, but we hope it'll go broader. But there will be a code of practice for each sector. And so there'll be a dairy code of practice, or horticulture, a red meat, and they'll be enforceable with fining powers. They'll be able to fine when they see abuse, and it covers overseas suppliers. At the moment, they're only consulting on the dairy sector because we know there's extremely high levels of evidence of abuse. What we are demanding that all codes for all sectors is started to be consulted on as soon as possible. I'll stop there because this is part of the regulatory side of things that we absolutely see as essential. But what we're talking about today is about the other side of it, what we can do to deliver an alternative market, a better route to market for farmers and growers. So we'll be regulating the bad stuff, but also really growing the good stuff, which is what we're about today. But it's useful to know about the regulatory background that we're also working on. Thanks, James.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Vicky. So before we go into breakout rooms, I just want to touch on this term farmer focused, and also use a bit of a case study to give an example of what one might look like. So this term farmer focus was introduced to me by colleagues at Growing Communities, who I'll touch on in a moment. Kind of as a framework, it is essentially about making supply chains and routes to market work for agroecological farmers, who are quite strangely not often sort of seen within the wider picture of food systems. At least they're often, I think farmers are often seen as this sort of producer in the background. And I think the current sort of food system doesn't do a very good job of actually telling farmers' stories and connecting farmers and consumers together very well. So it's about making sure that farmers are also paid a fair price for what they produce and sell, and that it's also linked to us as either food traders or as consumers, kind of working in a way as to ensure that happens, which includes kind of buying and consuming in a way that enables farmers to do what works best for their land and the environmental boundaries that they are working within. So it could also mean obviously giving space for farmers to actually be actors within the supply chain, or at least giving farmers a strong voice within it as well. And that could also mean kind of increasing the market share of what is often dubbed alternative markets. But it could also include, as Vicky was touching on a bit there, and going even further, having maybe a bit of a more sort of thorough review of the kind of wholesale supermarket side of food supply. But really what we're talking about is having much more diversity within markets and designing them in a way so that farmers can access them in a fair way. I think kind of finally, and I know it is mentioned often, kind of without much action behind it, but farmer focused also means connecting consumers with the farmers who produce their food. And to me, kind of food provenance is really important, and it's really undervalued by the supermarkets and the really big processors and others and big kind of multinationals and corporations who dominate the supply chain at the moment. So all in all, I think what we're talking about here are routes to market which pay producers a fair price, which provide better access to a diverse range of markets, which are both much more transparent and accountable to both kind of the producer and the consumer. So kind of really, we just simply want farmers to be seen within this kind of framing of food systems. But I think it's quite good to kind of touch on an example of what a farmer-focused supply chain or route to market might look like. So I just want to touch on Growing Communities, who I mentioned earlier. They are based in Hackney in East London, and we work quite closely with Growing Communities on projects and on work and stuff. So the way Growing Communities kind of works is they buy directly from organic farmers close to London, and they also grow some of their own produce as well on 2 different farms in East London. And then they use this produce to run a box scheme and sell at a farmer's market directly to local residents in Hackney. So they have this direct relationship between kind of buying from agroecological farmers and then supplying to consumers that healthy, sustainable, affordable food. So they're kind of providing that link, that kind of link up of the farm to fork approach, I suppose. And growing communities are what's called a better food trader, and that's a movement in the UK to really kind of increase the market share of these markets like growing communities. So that essentially means that growing communities are kind of like a market for farmers to sort of sell into, I suppose, but they work directly with them. But they use that relationship, that model of direct relationships. And growing communities work on a set of principles, some of which I put up on the slide there. So Vicky and I were talking to Julie, who helps run growing communities, and she was saying yesterday that they ensure that the producer gets about 50% of the food pound, which, based on the earlier 8% average that I mentioned earlier in the slides, that's a huge amount more that farmers are getting. Which is really important for them and for the food system as a whole. They also pay their staff the living wage, and they sell their produce at an affordable rate. So I guess if we were using jargon terms, you'd call that maybe a win-win-win. And also, I think something else which I really like about them and is important, and I know that actors within the dominant supply chain at the moment do this to some degree as well, but they monitor their environmental and their social impacts, which I think is really really important. So they're quite sort of transparent and accountable. And to me, this approach is a really good example of a farmer-focused route to market. And as also growing communities would do would probably advocate for as well as we do, is this is one example and there are different examples, and having that diversity in markets is really important. So on that note, we are going to try do some breakout rooms. So there's 170 odd people, which is a lot less than 380 that registered, so hopefully this will be a little bit more manageable. So because there's only really Vicky and I and Dave the volunteer kind of doing this, we probably won't be able to be in all of the breakout rooms at once, obviously. So what I ask is we're going to split you into probably groups of 4 or 5. So if you can kind of self-facilitate the groups, and if one member can capture the main points that you raise, that would be great. I'm going to share a Jamboard, which is basically an online interactive whiteboard, which I'm hoping people will be able to use to capture maybe the top 3 or 4 main points that you have in your discussions during these breakout rooms. And I'll share a link in a minute so that you can access it. And instead of doing any real quick feedback, Vicky and I will touch on some of the things that we think about from these breakout rooms ourselves. So the first one is going to be, what we'd really like you to do is to discuss what you think the barriers are to making routes to market work for farmers. So really focusing on what the barriers are. I think we're going to give each group about 15 minutes. So if you can make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak, obviously that would be great. If you finish early and you kind of want to just come back to the main room, by all means, please do. I believe that Zoom actually brings you back automatically. So yeah, hopefully it should all work out. I think Dave has also set it all up, so you should soon get a something saying please join this breakout room coming up. I've just shared the Jamboard, so if people want to open that link, that will be, hang on a second.
So specifically about barriers to making routes to market work.
Yeah,
that's what we want
exactly.
To
yeah,
talk
so
about.
we're going to do a second breakout room. Yeah, but for this one, really focus on what the barriers are to making better routes to market work for farmers. So hopefully you've got the Jamboard link. If you can open that up, when you open it up, on the left-hand side, you'll see a toolbar, and I think it's the 4th one down, and that's the sticky notes. So if anybody in your group would like to add something on there or to capture the points you make, if you could just use sticky notes to try and keep it at least a little bit tidy, that would be really good. But equally, if it gets a bit chaotic and doesn't work, please don't stress about it. This is mainly about getting people to talk about things, and hopefully ideas and thoughts will spark. So,
James, I'm afraid it's saying that there's too many people viewing the file.
Really? Right, okay. Well, in that case, don't worry too much, as I said. If people can, maybe when we come back to the main Zoom room, people can add their comments into the chat. That would be great. And then we can capture it and save the chat. So, Dave, do you want to set up the...
Yep, I'll do it for you now.
Yeah, groups of about 4 or 5, please, would be fantastic.
Actually, James, some people have said just refresh and it lets you in, and it did work for me. So people might find it works.
Okay.
Oh, fab.
We'll give it a go and we'll see how it goes.
Cool. I'm going to assign the breakout rooms now.
Thank you very much. Best of luck, everyone, and enjoy the conversation. Right, so I hope that was really interesting for everybody. I hope you had some really good discussions. Thank you for people who were kind of managing to fill out the Jamboard. Sorry if it was kind of a bit chaotic or anything, but I hope it's worked for some people. If you didn't manage to use it and you want to post any of the kind of thoughts that came out of your breakout room into the chat, please do. That'd be really good. I hope you're now seeing my screen with my slides again. Thinking about some of those barriers, I think we just wanted to touch on some potential ones that we've come across through our work, and which I think was also coming out in the discussion I was in our breakout room, and I'm sure it came out in some of the others. So, things like some of the barriers might be that there's a real kind of lack of infrastructure in place, especially on a kind of a localized infrastructure network level that isn't kind of owned by just kind of big processors or supermarkets, but which is owned by the people, the actors who are producing food, and the better food traders who are selling it. So I think that can be a bit of an issue. We also know that kind of finance can be a really big barrier to small and medium-sized enterprises being able to kind of access grant schemes and things like that, because they often have quite high baseline application amounts, which are too high for their requirements and for what they want. So obviously there's a real need to change the way that both national and local government kind of design their grant schemes so that they are inclusive of kind of all sort of farming and food business sizes. I do sometimes wonder if there's kind of a lack of access to sort of independent, good quality marketing advice and support as well, which could help farmers and kind of better food traders get off the ground. I'm sure that's there, but is there a way that we can share it better? Is there a way of having better knowledge exchange? I think there's some kind of barriers to overcome there. And also, talking about, and this actually came up in our conversations about whether it's quite difficult to access what's often dubbed as these sort of alternative markets, which I'm not a massive fan of the word alternative, but it's often used. But yeah, whether there's barriers to being able to access them because they can be difficult to get into or difficult to find. So, how can we overcome those kinds of barriers? How can we make sure that it's kind of easy for producers to access is, I think, is an important question to ask. So we're going to go into a second breakout room, and this one is going to be focused more on what people think the opportunities are for making routes to market work for farmers. So again, we'll follow the same format. Dave is going to break you back into those groups of sort of 4 or 5 or however many it was. Again, they'll have to, if you can kind of self-facilitate them, make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to talk. And if you can, again, try and capture the kind of the 2 or 3 or 4 main points that come out of your conversation, that would be great. I'm just going to reshare a different Jamboard link for a totally different Jamboard. So if you can use that one instead, that would be wonderful. Right, here we go. Hopefully you've got that link again, if people want to use that, use the sticky notes again, that would be fantastic. And yeah, Dave, if you want to go ahead and split everybody into those breakout rooms, that would be fantastic.
Of course, no worries.
Right, I hope that was another kind of really good breakout session that you had, and hopefully you had some, some really good thoughts and ideas came to you. Thank you very much for kind of filling out those Jamboards. They're brilliant. They're so kind of colourful, and there's all sorts going on them. It was really interesting to watch them being filled out. So yeah, thank you very much for sticking with it and using it. So just to touch on some things that we might see as potential opportunities that Vicky and I have been talking about it sort of recently with some of our members and our partners at Sustain. So I think we're really interested to look into ways in which you can enable greater collaboration and cooperation between farmers. I think it's one thing that has kind of struggled to get off the ground often in the UK is cooperative working. It does work quite well in other countries like France. So it's about, how can we learn from those and how can we build it? And I think collaboration between farms can obviously help to do things like, spread costs, exchange knowledge, increase things like purchasing power and selling power too, and really kind of giving farmers a greater voice within supply chains and kind of within the food system as a whole. One thing that came out of some research by the Food Foundation in April, they looked at impacts of the first COVID-19 lockdown in the UK on veg box schemes. And one thing they found was that a lot of them are really keen to obviously expand veg box schemes across the UK, but a barrier they come up to is kind of a lack of investment into local infrastructure for them to use. And that kind of feeds back to this problem of finance and it not being available to them. So what they want to sort of see is greater commitment from national and local government to invest in local infrastructure networks. And there are opportunities to do that through things like, hopefully there'll be opportunities to do that through things like the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which is going to be the replacement to the EU structural funds in the UK. So, there's some opportunities to really engage with government there and try and get them to open up the UK Shared Prosperity Fund for sort of local food and farming infrastructure and those farmer focused sort of supply chains that we're really keen to see happen. I think another important thing, which is a much bigger discussion, much bigger conversation, is really about kind of creating a vision. And this is something which has come out of engagement with various kind of partners and members of ours, is really creating a vision of what a better food system would look like. I think often we talk about the issues with it, but providing a vision could be a really good way of building towards something, and it could give government an opportunity to see what that kind of better food system would look like and how they can help enable it. Another thing, and this is another piece of work we're doing at Sustain, but which others can get involved in, is around getting food and farming into local councils' various different sort of action plans, like their climate and nature emergency pledges and their high street regeneration plans. There's some real opportunities there to make sure that kind of local food and farming is sort of integrated into those. And I think another thing is, and I think it's an important one, is obviously making sure that farmer-focused routes to market are convenient for farmers and consumers, but making sure that farmers can access them is a really kind of important one to bear in mind. So, moving on, we're just going to have a couple more slides, and then we'll be kind of drawing to a close. So we might not take up the whole hour and a half, but kind of next, I wanted to touch on the where to next, thinking about those opportunities. So we're obviously expecting the second part of the National Food Strategy to come out. We're not 100% sure on what it will say and what recommendations it will make, but there will hopefully be some stuff in there which is a positive for sort of farmer-focused routes to market. And I think we need to really encourage government to implement its recommendations. So that's one thing. I think another thing, as I mentioned earlier, is really kind of engaging with local councils and pushing them to integrate food and farming into their various different kind of action plans. So that could include supporting the Nature Friendly Farming Network. They've been working with a couple of other organisations to create a motion which can which kind of local residents, local people and constituents can share with their local councillors, and I think they're hoping to get that ready for the local elections in May 2021. So, you know, look out for that and share it with your local councillors as they're on the campaign trail, as it were. Another thing which Sustain has been doing is developing an action plan for local councils as well, giving them actions that they can take on food and farming within their local council areas on their nature and climate pledges. So again, another interesting one, and hopefully, you know, that will be up on our website soon for people to look at. Again, we're hoping to be part of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund co-design, and hopefully lots of different organisations and academics and researchers can get involved in that. I think that could be a really positive for helping to deliver on things like the localised infrastructure networks that are needed. So that's so kind of another one. I think, you know, we were talking about the opportunities earlier, and one is kind of how can we increase the market share of better food traders like growing communities that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. I think that's a really interesting one, and kind of really delivering that would be really good, I think. And we do need to have that slight sort of shift away from so much kind of power and money being centralized within such a small number of supermarkets, and really diversifying that that marketplace. And then another one which we've been thinking about a little bit over recent months is the Adding Value grant scheme that DEFRA did back in 2018, which helps support farmers to invest in on-farm processing facilities. It would be really good to really push for something like that again, so that, you know, to give farmers that support. And that kind of links into what I was saying earlier about the Food Foundation research. So we need to make those grant schemes work for smaller scale and sort of small and medium-sized enterprises. Another thing which everybody can do in the UK is write to your local MP and councillors, and we have the local elections in May this year, and really try and get the kind of food and farming picture in front of them. I think is just something that everybody can do. And I think sort of finally, one last thing to touch on is kind of really thinking about how we can support farmers to supply into better food traders. So yeah, it's just kind of a final kind of comment I wanted to make on that. So yeah, sort of really important one as well. Okay, so finally, just to touch on some of the things that we're doing, last sort of few things that we're doing at Sustain. I've already mentioned, you know, the action plan that we're building for local councils and a couple of other things, but we have some other ongoing pieces of work. So as Vicky mentioned earlier, you know, we're engaging with government and with the Groceries Code adjudicator. You know, and we're quite keen to push those better standards within supermarkets and to really deal with those kind of bad trading habits that do take place. And kind of within that wider sort of food systems piece, we're kind of doing a project on farmer focused supply chains. So we're really trying to up that project and get it going, and looking at infrastructure. I think we're quite interested in looking at how grain and oilseeds could be, how we could kind of get better market access and better quality market access for those sides of things. I think that's kind of a missing piece of the puzzle, because there's a lot being done on things like local abattoir infrastructure and food hubs and that sort of stuff. So there's that kind of the kind of arable farming side of things and how to support them better. And that will probably accumulate in some sort of public and parliamentary engagement work and campaigns as well. And we're just about to kick off some work looking at peri-urban farming and how to increase the amount of farming that takes place in urban areas. And I think that's a really interesting one, and looking at how you can bring more food production closer to where people live in cities and towns. And it's a really important one. And, you know, we have things like allotment societies, but how can you actually really increase the area of land in cities for really healthy, sustainable, affordable food production? And I just wanted to kind of say, you know, any of you who work in this area and are really interested in talking with us, that'll be fantastic. I've included our contact details on the last slide, which is just coming up now. So yeah, please, you know, drop us an email if this is an area you work in and you're interested in discussing things a bit more. That would be fantastic. And on that note, that's kind of about it from us, really. Finishing a bit earlier than 3:30, but kind of thank you very much for joining us. I hope you found it a good session. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you've enjoyed the breakout rooms and trying out Mentimeter or using Mentimeter if you've tried it before. I found it really interesting. Really good points being made. I'm really looking forward to kind of look through the Jamboard actually and look at all those sticky notes, which will be a bit of a task, but really
James,
good.
is it worth saying we'll be doing sort of blogs and articles? People will be able to see the sort of results of this workshop, I think, in some form.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll try and make sure that, you know, people can get access to those blogs and kind of all the summary and the feedback from the session, definitely. So yeah, just want to say thank you again actually to our RFC, and thank you, Dave, for being a fantastic volunteer and doing all the breakout room stuff. That was
no
brilliant.
problem. Well, thank you, James. Thank you, Vicky, for taking the time out today. An absolutely awesome workshop.
Grand. All right. Thank you very much. Vicky, do you have any kind of final things you'd like to say quickly? Or
no, just thanks everybody for joining us. Really fantastically useful, and I can't wait, as James says, to look through all the notes and yeah, onward. We've got a lot to do.
Lots to do.
Yeah.
Lots to do, but lots of positives.
Lots of opportunities. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Fantastic.
Very much.
Well, thank you very much for everybody. And on that note, kind of enjoy the rest of the conference.